Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back to another week in the life of Behind Beliefs and Behaviors. I'm Dr. Maisha. You know who I am. If you've been listening, I am your resident psychological safety, trust, and trauma informed communication consultant. And today I want to talk a little bit about accountability. Now, particularly, I want to talk about the language of accountability because I'm all things communication. And one of the things that I realize around accountability, especially when I work with my clients, my coaching clients, when I work with leaders, when I work with organizations, is that um, most times when there is a lack of follow through, when there's a lack of follow through on projects and organization, when there's a lack of follow through on one's set intentions, promises, goals, oftentimes is because it's a lack of accountability. And what I notice about why that happens is for a couple of reasons. Number one, I think some of it is people don't know how to set themselves up for success around accountability. They don't know how to hold themselves accountable. Like, what constitutes accountability? What constitutes holding oneself or setting oneself up for success in the way of holding oneself accountable? And then, in other instances, especially when it comes to teams and organizations and families, even, it's because people don't know how to hold others accountable. They don't know how to hold each other accountable, right? So there's a language to accountability, just like there's a language to emotion, there's a language to safety and trust, there's a language to setting boundaries, which, by the way, is part of the accountability structure. The accountability language is setting boundaries with ourselves and with others. And so when people don't change, it's generally because they're, number one, not holding themselves accountable, or they're not engaging in relationships where others are holding them accountable. So others are not holding them accountable, right? So it's a two-part thing. You have to hold yourself accountable, but you also have to have community that as backup for when our humanity sets in and we're not holding ourselves fully accountable, right? We might be holding ourselves 95% accountable, 99 or 98%, or even 90. But what happens is when we start to slip in holding ourselves accountable, when we start to slip in keeping our word to ourselves, that slippery slope is very insidious. And we wake up one day and we're wondering why nothing is getting done. It's because we held ourselves accountable, not 100%, but 99 or 98 or 95 or 90 or 80%. And suddenly 98% becomes the norm, and then 95% becomes acceptable, and then 90% becomes acceptable. You see where I'm going here, right? So we must have backup accountability structures, because oftentimes there's only so much that we can hold ourselves accountable before we slip, because guess what, we're human. So in order to set ourselves up for success, we need to have our community holding us accountable, and we need to be in relationships where we are also practicing holding others accountable as well. So to that point, to that vein, that pathway, people don't know how to hold themselves accountable. So let's talk about that for a moment, and then we're going to shift over to how do you hold another accountable. So if you want to be holding yourself accountable, number one, you have to know what you're holding yourself accountable to. That means, what is the goal? What is the action that you promised? And by when did you promise that? Right. So there has to be a clarity of the thing that you're being held accountable to. Now, if it is an ongoing behavior or an ongoing practice, there's a structure for that. Or if there is a one goal and a one thing that you're being that has an end in sight. So it's a goal, it's an endpoint, it's a deadline. Then there's an accountability structure for that. So the easy one is the deadline. How do you hold yourself accountable to a deadline? Number one, you calendarize it. Um, and then you have to set your structure up for how you're going to get it done. And I like to, as a person who is generally a big picture person and needs things broken down into chunks for me to workably get to a goal, to reverse engineer a goal and calendarize each point of that goal, and then hold yourself accountable, making sure it's on your calendar, make sure you time blocked it so that you can complete the elements to get to that goal. So that's one of the ways, though. That's one of the internal structures. That's one of the structures for holding ourselves accountable. The other thing is the motivation. We're not always going to be motivated to do things. I'm not always motivated to do this podcast every week. I'm not always motivated to write my articles. I'm not always motivated to do a lot of things. Yet, I have a commitment. And so when we have calendarized and reverse engineered our goal, and then we have the time block in place, what keeps us coming back is the commitment. And we have to have a commitment that's bigger than ourselves. So for me, this commitment to transforming the culture of healthcare, um, transforming the culture of organizations so that people do feel safe, do feel seen, heard, respected, and valued, do have a voice, right? It's a form of healing. It's a form of it's therapeutic in a way. It's a form of giving people voice and freedom, which has been always my bigger value and it's a form of empowering others. That's always been like my big picture commitment, my big picture why. So if I know that I'm doing that, then I keep my eye on that. It keeps me coming back to those various structures that I have in place, because that's the bigger commitment. So we have to have that bigger commitment pulling us, that bigger value. I talked about it in an earlier podcast. If you haven't listened to it, there's a podcast um, around several months ago around accessing the power of values, right? When we understand our values and we have our goals aligned with our values, and we have our behaviors and our accountability aligned with the values, it really helps us to continue to come back to those behaviors. So that's we talked about being accountable to a particular goal. But then when we're being accountable to a behavior, that is very different. All right. So a lot of what I talk about is more ongoing behavioral change, ongoing expansion of and development of emotional intelligence, of our skills of communication. And there is accountability inside of that too. Ongoing accountability around boundaries, respecting and setting, um, eh, creating safe environment. Those are a little bit more nebulous behaviors or abstract behaviors to keep track of, like, what is the end goal. But we can hold ourselves accountable to the behavior, and we can hold others accountable to the behavior. Now, right now, I'm talking about holding ourselves accountable. We're going to shift in a minute to holding others accountable. But when we are holding ourselves accountable to a behavior, number one, we must get an accountability partner, someone who is who is either on the level or already doing the thing that you want to do, someone who is willing to have the hard conversations, to call you in when you are not meeting the commitment of who you say that you want to be or who you say that you truly are, and to be checking in with that person on a regular basis. Okay. So it could be a weekly check-in, it could be a bi-monthly check-in, it could be even a monthly check-in. But that accountability structure of another person It is an outside motivator to be able to continue because we get something when we can come to our accountability partner and say, yes, I did that. Like I am doing that. It that we get an internal um like dopamine hit, if I were to be frank about it. And so having that external accountability partner is a very useful way to hold oneself accountable to behavior and ongoing goals. The other piece is, again, having that value in place, being very clear about what are your values and what are your priorities, and asking yourself frequently, doing frequent check-ins. Am I aligned? Is my value aligned with my behavior? Am I acting in accordance with what my priorities are? Am I choosing behaviors and actions that are aligned with my priorities? Am I setting the boundaries I need to set? And then the other thing is accessing how it feels when you are inside of the behavior that you're endeavoring to achieve. Now, sometimes it's difficult, it's uncomfortable, right? But discomfort often is expansion. But when you complete, when you know that you're in line, that feels good on the inside. All right. So that's the self accountability. How you're These are some structures, and there are many others. I think that when we talk about keeping ourselves accountable, it is very important to engage in ongoing growth and development. Because if we do not engage in our own ongoing growth and development, skills development, internal mindset development, um, thought pattern development, if we don't continue to engage in that internal, what people call soft skills, what I call essential skill development, then it will be very difficult to hold ourselves accountable. There will be backsliding, right? And I'm talking about the individual because, as I've shared many times in my talks, the work that I do, I think that it's important to have systemic change, policy change, procedure change. However, systems are run by people, they're created by people, right? These paradigms are created by people. These are people paradigms. Policies are created by people. Processes are created by people. And procedures are created by people, are done by people, right? So this is a people issue. And when leaders start to recognize the value of personal development inside of the profession, there's really no separation between personal and professional development, because personal development is professional development. So let's talk about holding others accountable, because that in and of itself is just as much of a skill as holding oneself accountable. So when we become accountability partners for each other, and particularly that you can apply this as on the inside of individual, but you can also apply this in organizations, leadership, and um, to employees to leadership. How do you hold your leaders accountable? How do leaders hold each other accountable? How do executives hold themselves accountable? How does a CEO be held accountable, right? How do you hold people accountable? Well, there is a language of accountability, and that language is very similar to the language of boundaries, the language of integrity, and it sounds like commitment. This is the commitment that you made. It sounds like understanding a person's values. I come back to values over and over again because I was asked a question in my last speaking engagement. Um, and that question, I'm often asked this question from organizations who are wanting their leaders to be engaged in these conversations around trust and safety. How do I get my leaders involved? How do I hold my leaders accountable? And it starts with understanding what's important to them. What are their values? And so when we're holding others accountable, we have to listen for what's important to them, because whenever And we have to listen for what's the commitment made. And so the questions to ask are, what is the commitment that you're making specifically? How do you plan to create this? What is the structure? What is it that you need from your support team in order to make this happen? And by when? By when? And by when, perhaps, especially in organizations, is the most slippery, because there can be multiple moving parts and it's easy to say, well, I don't know when. But when you declare a win, then it sets up the structure for accountability. It actually sets up the structure for successful accountability and for successful accomplishment of the goal. So that we're talking here about SMART goals: specific, measurable. How will you know that you've achieved that goal? Right? So specific, what is it specifically? Measurable, how will you know you achieved it? Achievable, is it achievable? And what's and achievable being workable in the amount of time that you're about to state. Responsible, like what are the consequences, positive and negative consequences? Relevant, is it relevant to what's going on? And relevance is important because we talk. I often am asked the relevance of psychological safety in, especially in healthcare spaces, but in workforce spaces, and we look at what's happening in the turnover in organizations and why that's happening. And I've done several engagements where I always ask the question, when I put up the list of characteristics that constitute breaking trust and threatening psychological safety. And then I ask organizations, or I ask the people in organizations, how many of you have experienced any of these characteristics? Without question, always there are several of these characteristics that are being named. And so we want to be clear that it's relevant. This is a relevant conversation. So relevant, and then time based. And we must put a time on it, not like a specific time, within the next 1 year, 12 months, or within the next 24 months, or by this date. And what's important about the time is that it sets up the parameters for, okay, let's reverse engineer how we're going to get this done. And then that's the frame, that's the container for the accountability structure, initially for the accountability structure, right? And if it's an ongoing behavior, there still can be a time put onto it. It's a little bit more nebulous, but there still can be a time. Like, how will you know when you have it, and by what time do you want to have this level of whatever it is, engagement or trust or whatever that is, right? Quantifying that a little bit. And so when we ask those questions and we listen for the answers to those questions in the people with whom we're holding them accountable, then we can be watching and we can say, you remember you said this was important to you, and your commitment was to this. And so this is how we hold people. This is the language of holding people accountable. You said, you said that you were committed to this. You said this was important to you. And by bringing back the value, you get them present to their commitment and their value, right? And then it's my observation. Then it's your observation. Well, what I'm seeing is not in line with what you say you're committed to or what you say is important to, right? So the observation is the second part of that language, right? And then it opens the conversation. And then the next question is, how will you restore that? Like, how will you get back on track? Are you committed to getting back on track? How will you get back on track so that you're doing what's important? You're meeting the goal that you said that was important to you. You're doing the behavior that you said was in line with this value, right? What does it take? What other structures, what other support systems do you need? That's another thing. Because oftentimes when people are not, when they're failing to be accountable, if they really are committed, there's a support structure that's missing. So what other supports do you need? Right. And then you have to question if there is a repeated violation of their own value, if there's a repeated um, out integrity, like not doing what you say you're going to do in the time that you're going to do it, then you have to question, is it really important to you or just saying it's important to you? Like, what are you really prioritizing it? Or are you not prioritizing it? And so these are the kind of conversations that we hold when we're holding others accountable. I think the most important takeaway from that language is, now you said that you wanted to do this. You said this was important to you, but you're doing this. So I named. There's an episode I did on naming and noticing. Right. I noticed that you're doing this, but you said this was important to you, and you said that you were committed to this. Care to explain? you know? So that is, these are some tips around the language of accountability. And it is similar to the language of boundaries as well, right? Um, I'll give you an example. Um, I'm engaged in consulting with an organization, with my anti-racism partner, and we have, um, inside of this training, or inside of this consulting, we did our anti-racism training. And as part of the training, we ask that they engage in a project. And so, how do we know that they are um, moving on their journey, their anti-oppression journey, is by where they are in their project. So this is a structure for accountability for them. And then we check in with them on a initially monthly, but now quarterly or so basis to see where they are. Right? Where are you? Where did you say you wanted to be? Where are you engaging other people to help support you? What supports do you need? And what we're finding is the organization is transforming because, number one, they made the commitment. We didn't make the commitment for them. They have strategic goals. They made the commitment. They chose their projects based on what was important to them. They formed the teams. They have ownership in it. And that this is the senior leadership team that we started with. And then we trained the directors, and then we trained the managers. And what we're finding is, because of this commitment and this structure of accountability that we guided them to, they are able to meet certain goals. And one of the things that happened out of that is that in their last they've been doing evaluation meetings, and I had the opportunity to sit in on one of their HR meetings, and they were going over their engagement, and some of their stats, and one of the things that was said was, the biggest improvement was inclusiveness, and the feeling of belonging. And then there was work to do around safe psychological safety. There was still work to do there, but it improved, right? And so they can actually see where they things made a difference and where there was a gap. And so this is how accountability works. This is how accountability works. Um, so that is what I wanted to share today. I feel like, there's a lot. There's not a lot of conversations that happened around accountability, but not just accountability. I mean, people always say, "Oh, we have to hold people accountable. We have to hold people accountable," but there's not a lot of conversation about how to do that, how specifically. And that's what I do in a lot of my trainings. That's what I do in the course that I have, Communication That Transforms. There's very specific language on how do you listen to people in a way where you can hold them accountable? And what is it that you say to hold people accountable? What is it that you say inside of those conversations? Um, Also, how do you listen in a way that you can catch those out integrities? You can catch those subtle nuances of conversation that are activators um, to speak up and hold people accountable. That's a lot. And how do you do it in a way that helps people, that doesn't come off as accusatory, that doesn't come off as threatening, that doesn't come off as condescending? How do you, what exactly do you say? That's a lot of what is contained inside of the communication that transforms course. That's a lot of what I teach, is what are the nuances of communication that actually make it effective. So if you're inside of an organization and you know this conversation is important, for your organization, you know that leaders need this, you know that even if you're a community-based organization, you're like, oh, how do we engage our community to know how to advocate for themselves? How do we give them the language? Then I invite you to reach out to me, and let's talk about how do we get these conversations into our leadership, into our organization, and into our communities, such that we improve their relationship, and and the organizations improve their relationship between their leaders and employees, and we have a thriving workforce and organization. All right. So if you want to do that, you can reach out to me here, mindremappingacademy.com, mindremappingacademy.com. And there I have an assessment. I have an assessment, and I'll be posting the link to that assessment very shortly. But if you're listening to this podcast um, on asynchronously, you will see in our show notes, you'll begin to see the assessment. It's a trust and psychological safety assessment, and it'll give you a score as to where you are and where your areas of growth opportunity are. So if you need assistance with closing that gap and increasing that assessment score, I am here to assist. So please share this information, because I think people need to know how to hold each other accountable. People need to know what the language of that is, and people need to know, how do you hold yourself accountable? What are the structures? How do you set yourself up for success in that way? And so, um, share this episode, leave a review. Don't forget to subscribe so that you know exactly when these episodes are coming out, because I think these are very important conversations. And if you're listening to this live, then go and subscribe to the Behind Beliefs and Behaviors podcast, and go and listen to some of the past episodes that we've already done on communication, on values in the organization, and with some of our guests around leadership. So I look forward to hearing from you. Again, reach out to me, mindremappingacademy.com. If you're a leader in an organization, want me to come speak on psychological safety and cultivating trust, or on communication. And I look forward to hearing from you. So until the next time we see you, please stay empowered.